This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Matt Wallaert. He has a very cool new book out, Start at the End: How to Build Products That Create Change. Matt makes the point that deciding what to create at modern companies often looks like an episode of Mad Men. People throw ideas around until one sounds sexy enough, and then they scale immediately. The result? Companies overspend on marketing to drive engagement with products and services that people don't want and won't help them to be happier or healthier. Any of you entrepreneurs out there know that feeling. Where the heck do you start? And Matt's kind of got this novel framework, this new framework for creating products and services, very much grounded in behavioral science. And starting at the end is where you begin. A guy like Matt, his benefit to all of us is he goes out there and he dissects the winners, the losers, the successes, the failures, gets under the hood to find out what is really driving their creativity, what is driving their creativity in their new products and services, and what the heck can we all take from their efforts. Without further delay, let me jump right into my guest today, Matt Wallaert. How are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm catching you in New York City.
Yeah, I am in New York City, bright and early.
Well, it's a little bit later here. I'm in Saigon.
In Saigon?
There you go, huh? That's the shift. You didn't expect that one, did you?
Well, I was like, we said a little bit later, so I was like, oh, probably Europe, right? Like that would be the right thing. Definitely a totally different time zone in Saigon. What are you doing in Saigon?
Short story, happily living in San Diego in 2013, got hired by a Hong Kong bank for a 4-month speaking tour in Asia, 25 cities, 13 countries. When it was over, I said, I ain't going back to San Diego. And I said, where did I have the most fun in 4 months? Saigon won.
When I was 15 years old, so I'm a first generation college kid, grew up in very rural Oregon. Like I still wear like cowboy boots and a big old belt buckle. But when I was 15, I got the chance to go to school for 2 years in Hong Kong. So I left my family and went to school in Hong Kong for 2 years with kids from 80 countries. So I speak Chinese and have traveled all over Asia when I was young. And it was totally culture shocky because I was this rural Oregon, first generation college sort of kid who had a really amazing experience. So I could definitely see if that had happened when I was like the 30-year-old version of me, I too would have just like, although I probably would have ended up probably in the Philippines.
I did it as the 43-year-old version of me.
But you look so young in this picture. You're much better. I'm 37. You're not allowed to look better than people younger than you. Don't you know the rule? You're required to look your age, you motherfucker.
You know, I'll tell you what the secret is, though. If there is any secret, I've had 7 years of yoga. For whatever reason, that stuff is slowing down cellular aging.
I can't do any physical activity sport thing that is not totally engaging. My mind goes back to work every time. This is the problem of being a scientist. I'm like, oh, I'll just think about science. I'm thinking about science. I'll be in the middle of yoga class thinking about science. As a consequence, I am the opposite of yoga. I'm a boxer. I can only do things where like, hey, if my mind waters.
Does it quiet your mind, boxing?
100%. It gets your instincts, like your body says you need to pay attention to this or you're going to get hit in the face. If I go to yoga, I come out more stressed because I spent my time thinking probably about some science thing that I can't get out of my mind.
Let me share with you, though. I got to tell you, if you ever make it to Saigon, I'll take you to a yoga class where I promise you any clothing that you're wearing will feel like you went swimming after. I wouldn't do it if it didn't shut my mind off. Sometimes the mind will go for 30, 40 minutes into the last 10 minutes and it finally shuts off. So maybe your boxing would get me there faster.
If you described to me what you feel after a yoga class, I would tell you it is very similar to what boxing feels like for me.
Without the brain damage.
Without the brain. Well, but the nice thing about, the beautiful thing about getting old, I used to be a better boxer. Now I'm a shitty boxer. I don't actually need someone to throw a punch at my head, thankfully. Even if someone is throwing a punch at my head, I have an amazing helmet and a lot of stuff to protect me. Because I definitely, as a younger man, when I boxed more aggressively, I actually remember being at Microsoft, being like the head, sort of head of behavioral science at Microsoft. And there's this kid who wanted to be the first pro boxer from, I'm going to forget the country. It might have been Tibet. I think he was Tibetan. And he was like, he wanted to be the first pro Tibetan boxer. He didn't know how to spar. Like he just only could go 100%. So I hate getting in the ring with him because he just couldn't pull back. And he rang my bell once and I was like, I make my money with this brain. I probably should not be doing this. So I was like, I'm not getting in the ring with this kid anymore, A. And B, I'm going to go find the very best helmet that money can buy. And I am only going to wear this helmet. And I'm going to box other 37-year-olds who won't try and take my head off.
Well, I have to say, as you mentioned boxing, I won't sit here and be some kind of like a babe in the woods. I was 10 years a baseball catcher, so I can't tell you how many foul pitches I took to the head and how many concussions probably came that way. So I hear you.
It is unbelievable. I think people don't, particularly being a catcher, I think people don't recognize how dangerous being a catcher in baseball is, because people are like, baseball's, you sit there and hit home runs, right? It's not a sport with injuries. And if it is a sport with injuries, they're like running style injuries. I'm like, no, dude, like that ball is going very fast. It hurts and it will hit you in the head.
Yeah, I still recall one particular pitcher, a lefty, throwing about 90 miles an hour. And it was like the ball came in slow motion. It hit the plate, and I knew where it was going next. And I was already screaming about the groin pain before it happened. Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, it's funny. When I started this podcast, it was a trading podcast, kind of about my books and stuff. And then one day I kind of figured out, well, I want to branch out. I'm getting this interest level, and this was maybe like in 2014. And I reached out to a Duke professor named Dan Ariely that you might know personally, perhaps for all I know.
I do in fact know Dan personally.
So anyways, Dan was my first kind of like non-trading guest. And then while trying to reach out to get somebody else, I was like, well, gosh, I might as well go for Daniel Kahneman next. He didn't respond. But then I did something kind of clever. I'd done a documentary years before where I'd interviewed a guy named Vernon Smith who shared the Nobel with Kahneman that year. So I got Vernon to come on, and then I reached back out to Daniel and I said, hey, do you want to come on? And he goes, oh, I listened to your podcast with Vernon. It's really good. I'll come on. And then once I had him on, then I was like, I started just asking everybody under the sun that I had no connection with at all. And then I think people were embarrassed. Like, well, I can't say no to this guy, Mike, because he had Kahneman on.
That's right. Well, I'm a first generation college kid and knew nothing. And it is amazing to me how much of stuff like that happens, where people are like, TED is one of those, right? They're like, oh, you spoke at TED? Sure, you could speak at whatever the hell you want, right? Like, because there are like all of these little weird, like, if this one thing happened, then I'm like, yeah, for sure, fine. I actually got into startups in some ways very similar to the story you just told. So I was at Thrive. This was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't know, quite a while ago, right? Startups weren't that big of a thing. But at the time, and mostly still, academics, right, just list their email and office phone number on the department website. They called Dick Thaler. They were a personal finance startup. They were Mint.com's biggest competitor. They're called Thrive. Richard Thaler had done all this sort of personal economic, behavioral economic work. They just called Dick Thaler, and he picked up the phone, and he talked to him for like an hour. And at the end, they were like, will you join our advisory board? And he was like, no. Like, maybe he'd give a different answer now. I have no idea. Like, I don't know if Dick's like sitting on boards these days. He was like, yeah, no, like, who are you? But he said, there's this grad kid at Cornell who does work in this area, and you should go talk to him, go talk to Matt Wallaert. That's how they got to me, was through Dick Thaler. I just had picture like sort of this young entrepreneur cold calling Dick Thaler. I think this was before the Nobel. One of the hobgoblins, I think, actually, of privilege, and I've become increasingly aware over the years of my privilege as a white male, but like coming from a not super privileged background, first generation college, et cetera, it would never have occurred to me that you could just pick up the phone and call someone famous. It would not have occurred to me that like that was a thing you could do and that people did that. I think I would have been stunted by my own background and not been able to do it.
It's a great point you make. And I mean, my whole career has actually been based off this. I don't know how or why. I think I actually might have, you're going to laugh. I think I figured this out from Anthony Robbins, who basically was like, go find the people that you really want to learn from, the highest of the high, and just go straight to them. And I started doing that in my 20s, and it actually worked. I met crazy hedge fund managers are that way. And the little thing that you just mentioned about the academic's email address, maybe we shouldn't give that away because that still works to this day every time. Nobel Prize winners answer their emails and they see your emails. Now, maybe they're responding to mine because it says interview request or whatever, but they absolutely, those emails work and they see them.
The only exception are people, in fact, like the ones you already named.
But both Kahneman and Ariely, I got off their webpage.
That's right. Well, but Dan these days has a bot in front of it or has an assistant in front of it. So people who have become engaged with the business world or become really popular have like put fences up in front of them. But yes, in general, you're talking about a group of people. And I've tried to emulate that. I have this book coming out and I'm having the weirdest book experience because the book experience is designed for consultants. It's designed for people who want to go make a bunch of money speaking. Because I come from academia, I make my money at my job. Everything else I do because I care about behavioral science, and that's how I choose to interact with the world. And so I don't charge speaking fees. And if there is a speaking fee, I just ask them to donate it to their local domestic violence shelter. I'm not attuned to that sort of experience that is the like, well, let's go do this for consultant purposes. So as a consequence, I've tried really, really hard to emulate the academic mentors who were so important to me. So I have my email on my website and I have these open calling slots that literally anyone can book. Like, here is a slot, anyone can book it. You can get a half an hour with me. Now, there may be no open slots for 6 months and you'll have to be patient, but anyone should have access to people with knowledge and power. I mean, if we want to change the sort of egalitarian nature of the world, like I get in this argument over Twitter periodically with sort of a well-known New York VC about double opt-in intros. Fred Wilson is very in favor of double opt-in intros, meaning if you and I are going to get introduced to each other by someone, that person has to ask you and ask me, do you want to get introed? I don't believe in that.
That's too messy.
Yeah, if you're my friend, if you trust me, if we've worked together, if Michael and I have a relationship where he's going to take my intro, I'm not asking Michael first. I'm just going to intro the person that I want to intro to Michael. Because the moment you say, well, Michael has to approve, now you've got all this opportunity for bias. What the hell is the point of an intro if I can't use my social cred to say, no, Michael, whatever your personal sort of feelings, this person who might be first generation or underrepresented or of color or female founder or any of these other categories that don't get responses. Like the whole point is that I am using my social credibility with you to make that possible. And double opt-ins, I think, destroy that. And I'm so interested in, and I love that that has been your career. I love that you have got to where you are by having learned that lesson and going directly to the people. I hope that we continue to live in a world where those people pick up the phone and answer those emails.
I just look at it and I say, I don't care what someone's net worth is. I don't care who they are in terms of CV. If I feel like I can make a legitimate contribution or have a legitimate conversation with them, or I'm not wasting their time by contacting them, I will do it. I have no fear of doing that. And by the way, I should say too, you mentioned the delay on potentially reaching you. Dan did ask me to wait till the semester was over. So I had to give it a 3-month delay. But that's another lesson right there is, do you really want it? So he said, hey, give me 3 months and hit me back. And then he honored his word. So, that's completely another lesson. Let me shift us then, though, because we can keep talking about fun stuff. I want to start with something big picture about your world. Because, in my kind of trading world, I wrote about Kahneman's work in my trading books because it just seamlessly dovetails in there. But what in the world do we call this space these days? Behavioral science, behavioral econ, behavioral finance. What in the world? It's gotten so kind of, it reminds me sometimes of the hedge fund world. But do you sometimes just kind of want to punch the wall, speaking to you, Mr. Boxer, about how confusing all this nomenclature and naming is? It's kind of crazy.
It's interesting. I was actually having a conversation with a Swedish guy yesterday about this. I am very zen about it. I don't get frustrated by it for a very particular reason. I'm a big asshole feminist. I got very interested in sort of gender equity a few years ago. And one of the things that happens sometimes when you get into sort of doing a lot of diversity and inclusion work is you pick your head up and you realize I'm only talking to other diversity and inclusion people. And we're talking about things that matter, but they don't really matter. They're not really moving the needle. So you spend all your time being like, well, that person's not doing feminism right. And I don't want to do that. It doesn't make any sense. I sort of feel that way about behavioral science. Like, I hope one day my field is so big and so famous and so prevalent that it makes sense for me and Danny Kahneman or me and Dick Thaler to get on stage and argue about, is there a difference between behavioral science, behavioral economics, and behavioral finance, and whatever other things you want, social psychology.
Point well taken.
Right? I hope that happens. I hope it. But to me right now, I have a very simple definition that I use in the book. I sort of say it. I say, to me, behavioral science means, it doesn't mean having a PhD in anything. What it means is it is a process by which behavior is your outcome variable and science is your process. So if science is your process and behavior is your outcome, you are a practicing behavioral scientist. And I'm not getting into a debate about who's qualified to do that or who's allowed or like who can be in the room. If you are doing that and you can demonstrate that you're doing that, then I'm prepared to take you seriously and have that conversation with you.
Let me lead the audience into something simple and basic with you, your personality, your way of life. I think I instinctively get it, but let's talk about what you wear. Because I think I probably do something similar, but I've just not thought about it, maybe except subconsciously in some way. But you have thought about it, and there's a process here, or shall I say, because I'm so used to talking about process versus outcome, or shall I say you have the outcome, and that's what you've set in motion.
100%. And I thought about it so that I didn't have to think about it. I'll actually even make a pop culture reference. So there's a great movie, Training Day, Denzel Washington. He's hauling around this rookie who, through some plot machinations, is now very high. And they go to the house of this older cop. The rookie's sort of sitting in his chair, high, not talking, and Denzel Washington, the older cop, are sort of swapping things. And they're talking about, the streets and the secret of the streets. And the younger cop sort of chimes in. He's like, I know the secret of the streets. And Denzel Washington's like, shut up. You're high. You're dumb. But the older cop says, no, let him hear out. And he says, control your smiles and cries. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. That's so interesting. What I took it to mean, and what I think is interesting, is we all have a limited pile of mental resources, right? We all have cognitive attention is sort of the universal currency. It's not money, it's not time, it's cognitive attention, because money and time are just proxies for cognitive attention. What I started saying was, well, where do I want to spend my cognitive attention? And that inevitably means, like all budgeting, right? We're finance folks, right? Like all budgeting, that means you have to give something up. You cannot spend cognitive attention on everything. You don't expand that way. So I took my clothing and I automated it. I have a little robot on eBay. And so every day, every work day, I wear black cowboy boots or brown cowboy boots of the same brand. These days, Ariat. John Varvatos blue jeans, Nordstrom trim fit shirt, John Varvatos 40R blazer. That's it. And I just wear that on repeat. And so I have a little bot on eBay that buys it at a cheap enough price and sticks it in my closet. And if it doesn't fit, oh well. Right? I'll just redonate it because it was pretty cheap. I got it off eBay in the first place. I don't have to try anything on. I haven't been in a store shopping for clothes in 10 years. And I don't think about it. So that I can think about things like this podcast. So I can think about things like this book. That I can think about things that I actually want to spend my time on. And I think that goes for many things. I satisfice about food. I look at a menu, the first reasonably healthy, delicious sounding thing. Great. I'm ordering that menu down. I'm not keeping looking. And I'm not saying you should satisfice about everything, right? That would be a very impoverished version of the world. If I went to you and I said, Michael, spend no resources on anything at all, doesn't matter. That's such a weird extreme viewpoint. What I mean is find the things that you care about and you want to spend a bunch of time thinking about and a bunch of mental energy on, and then spend your energy there and automate everything else because it's not going to make you happy.
I love the way you phrase all this because, again, I feel like I've done some of this, but I just haven't thought about it. For example, I tell people all the time, if we go out to eat or whatnot, I could very easily eat whatever somebody else orders for me. I don't really need to think about it. That's one point. The second point, I've been a guy that's owned real estate for a long time, maybe 20 years, but I've not lived in my places for, over a decade. I prefer to live in a place that I don't own, serviced, everything's taken care of in it, from the cleaning to the furniture to the whatnot. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it at all because that stuff owns you. I prefer to just know what's the number I got to pay each month, and that's it. That's my sum total of thinking I want to know about my residence.
I think to your point, it owns you unless it doesn't. If home decor is your thing and decorating a home just makes you exceedingly happy, great, go do that. Fantastic. Like customize your place, If you love working on your house, there are people who love home improvement. If you love working on your house, do that. Spend time, be there. The great thing about the modern world is you can choose your smiles and cries. You can say, given enough resources, what you're going to not spend time on and what you are going to spend time on. And for you, hey, housing isn't the thing. For someone else, maybe it is. And that's okay. I recognize some people really care about clothes. I'm not telling people, hey, don't care about clothes. I'm just saying I'm going to choose not to. I found an outfit that I can simultaneously like go to the White House in and also like go to a party in, and kind of works everywhere. And I'm just going to wear that.
For both of our examples, I'm sure people listening right now are saying, oh, I relate to what Matt said. I relate to what Mike says. And then other people are saying, oh my God, these guys are freaking crazy people. You know?
That's right. The counter example I always give is, if you care about fashion, I care about computing. I've built my own desktop computer since I was a kid. I didn't have, my parents got us a computer very early, but we didn't have any money. Back then, it was a lot cheaper to build your own. And so I started building my own and got really into it. To your point, you would let someone choose your food. I would let someone choose my food. I would never let anybody choose my computer parts. I enjoy thinking about my computer parts. I enjoy that shopping experience. I enjoy reading about it and agonizing over it and making choices and et cetera. Like, I'm into that. There are people out there who are like, I would never let somebody automate my clothes. Sure, but would you pay for a subscription service that just sent you a laptop every 2 years? You don't need to know what's in it. You don't care about the brand. You don't understand what's in your laptop anyway. I could say it has a Core i72 and you'd be like, sure, great. Okay. You don't care. You just want a computer that works.
Let me take you, though, specifically, since you're mentioning the tech, we're talking behavioral work. Connect the dots on Microsoft, and even going back a little bit before that, connect the dots on you, how you started to go down this behavioral path and then ending up at Microsoft.
Some people feel like there are very distinctive pivot points in their lives. I don't generally feel that way. This is one exception where it's very clear for me how I got hooked. I took a intro psych class at Swarthmore. It was not very good. Amazing, amazing, amazing professor who was a great researcher, but not a good teacher. I sort of slept through the class, as did everyone else. But I took a second psych class with a guy who is widely considered one of the best teachers at Swarthmore, a guy named Andrew Ward, who's just amazing. Psychology of self-control, we read a study. It doesn't matter which one, but it happens to be the implicit association test study. I didn't disagree with the data, but I felt they were overreaching in their conclusion. Andrew said the most amazing thing I think any teacher can say to a student, which is, the field agrees with this interpretation, but this is science. So if you disagree, there is an orderly way to respond, and that is an experiment. You can prove that they are wrong by nuancing with a different experiment. And if you want to come to my lab and run an experiment, I'll be totally supportive of that. I was hooked, totally hooked, because for the first time in my life, I had found something where being right wasn't about being articulate or being high status or being the most powerful person in the room. It was about evidence that you could provide. I think about some of the most powerful people in our field, and some of them are not great speakers. They're not eloquent, but they are amazing experimenters, and they can theorize in a very orderly way that allows them to respond to the field. To me, that's amazing. That's beautiful. And I loved that. I loved the egalitarian nature. I went off into grad school. It's funny. I think everybody but me knew it wasn't going to go well. I had this amazing experiment where Tom Gilovich up at Cornell,
who has been on this podcast.
Oh, Tom's great. I love Tom. Tom called me and he said, we really want you. We love the research you do. You work with Barry and Andrew. We trust them. We trust you. We like you. We have this great fellowship for you because we know money's a concern. But you keep saying the words applied. And just to be clear, like, we do research here, like we contribute to the academe, like we're not an applied, capital A, applied psychology program. And I was like, yeah, sure, gonna love it. I was there for a year and I didn't love it. He was right. I was so interested in what do you do with science and how do you use science to make a better world? Because my father, who didn't go to college, didn't get a lot of opportunities, always said, you and your brother are my chance to change the world. I can't do it, but you can do it. I had this applied bent, quickly bounced out of grad school into a startup, came on as the head of product at Thrive, which was founded by Avi Karnani and Ori Schnaps, Mint.com's biggest competitor at the time, sold to LendingTree, was at LendingTree for a while, ended up at Microsoft, had a really great boss who saw the potential of what behavioral science could do at Microsoft, had been there a really long time and had all this social credibility that he could lend me, which was amazing. Got to spend several amazing years there building things. Eventually ended up as a director at Microsoft Ventures, here in New York, and then came over to where I am now at Clover Health as the chief behavioral officer, and have been for years trying to push how do you show people what really truly incorporating behavioral science into their company can do and can do in the world.
That gets into the practical, and that's where I kind of want to open up some of the content in your book that is about to hit, start at the end. This is, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit interesting because there's been so much effort in other fields where people are always saying, hey, don't fixate too much on the outcome, get a good process. For some things, that's going to be true, but there's definitely that light bulb when I'm going through your work and it's like, oh, okay, hold on. We could just sit there and go through the process all day long, but if we don't know where the heck we're going, we might not ever get there. Whereas if you say, this is it, this is where we're going, this is the goal, this is the behavior we want, then it's almost like, and I'm going to say this probably a little bit differently than you, but it's almost like you just backfill it all in after that. Like, you figure it out. You go down the process, and you're going to share with us some today about one way that you would like us to figure it out, a process that you've developed to get to that ultimate outcome. That's a different way of looking at things. And today, just in advance of this conversation, I was like, God, I really like this. Instead of just thinking about all the steps I need to take on all of our projects I'm working on, what do I want? What is the damn goal?
I actually think you said it very well. I do often feel like when you set a behavioral outcome well, it becomes sort of obvious what to do. The intervention actually sort of, at least for me, often feels sort of like, well, duh, right? I just hadn't articulated what I was trying to produce in the world. As I sort of say in the book, I sort of propose one process in the book, but I'm not wedded to that process at all. If you can riff on it or make a better process, fantastic. The thing I am very firm on, and the thing that I think really did inspire the title Start at the End, is we have to clearly articulate the behavior that we want. What will be true, observably true in the world when you are successful? When your product or company works, what will be observably true in the world? I will consider myself happy once there's some quarterly earnings call or somebody interviews a CEO for finance. Like, am I going to give you my money? And the question they're asking is, what will be true in the world because of the work that you're doing? That to me really is the key, and articulating that behavior. And I push, and it's hard to do. It sounds simple, but it's hard to do. Let's say you're a shoe company. Everyone will be happier with their shoes. Well, that's not a behavior. I don't even know what that means. I always force them to be like, okay, close your eyes and imagine somebody who's not happy with their shoes and someone who is happy with their shoes. Like, what's different? How would I know? I can't directly access happiness. I can't take Michael's brain and peel up the top and look and see like, yes, here's what happy looks like. All I can do is watch his behavior. So what behavior do I want when all is said and done?
Let's open this up with an example. It's kind of a big one you use in your work, the iPhone. And you discuss 2 whys. And what you're essentially getting at, and I'm going to let you roll with this, it's a world that doesn't exist but could. You've really talked about this as kind of the heart of your book. So why don't you discuss those 2 whys in the context of the iPhone example, even though you've just mentioned being at Microsoft, and I quickly take you to their competitor.
People forget at times, and I'm going to screw it up because it's been years since I've been there, but Apple has at this point one product. It is the iPhone. Maybe the AirPods and some other things and the iPad that have kind of gone alongside it. So maybe they have a couple. Microsoft, I can't remember what the number was, but it was like they have over 10 individually distinct billion-dollar businesses. Xbox, Office, Windows, Bing. Like, you just go down this list of you're like, we have individually 10 different things. They have done an amazing job of changing behavior. At the time, I always use the example of like, if you go outside and you get hit by a bus, the ambulance that picks you up will have been built in a factory that was like powered by Microsoft. You go to a hospital that's powered by Microsoft. Will be saved by a doctor who was trained at a educational facility powered by Microsoft. Like, the world runs on Microsoft. There's no hospital in the world being like, yeah, we're going to use Google Suite. That's going to be our core backbone. You can't run a hospital on a core backbone that is anything but Microsoft. And I just think that's amazing.
The love for tech, though, it always started with that guy in the black T-shirt in the auditorium introducing the new Apple gadget. Microsoft never got that kind of love.
It did never get that kind of love, but I think that's actually sort of the point of the book is like, does it matter if people love you if they do the thing that you want them to do? I have a 4-year-old, almost 3.5-year-old. And, as people know, 3.5 can be a tough age. And there are times when he's like, I hate you. And I'm like, That's okay. You're allowed to have that emotion. That emotion will change. What is important is that you understand what behavior that we want from each other. I too, in fact, talk to my 3.5-year-old that way, which probably accounts for why he sometimes hates me.
If I was to keep you though on this iPhone and the whys, because you're kind of laying out two things. It's like, why do that in the first place? And why were we not doing it already?
I tell product people all the time, you should read sci-fi, and not for leisure, but for work. Because what is sci-fi but picturing an alternative universe that is different in some key way? And that's really all product development is. That's all product design is saying there's some more optimal version of the world. And we want to get to that more optimal version. So when we describe an outcome behavior, we're describing this world. And then the next step is to describe the world that we have today. If I'm saying the world I want is one in which people carry their phone all day, every day. It is the tool of choice. 99% of tool-based moments will be fulfilled by this phone, and they will carry it, and I have these behaviors in my mind. And I say, okay, well, that's not true of today. There's two questions. Why would anyone want that? Why would anyone want to have an omni tool, which hopefully is relatively obvious if in the case of a pro-social thing like that?
Not obvious 15 years ago.
Well, maybe it was if I said it that way. If we took away the fact that it was a phone, right? The phone is the intervention. If I said, is it obvious to you why someone would want to be able to basically have an outsourced brain that could add cognitive capacity, whether it was memory or whether it was active processing or whether it was informational retrieval or whether it was exposure to happiness things, hedonic things? The way that I would say that we know this is before there was the iPhone, there was Star Trek. Star Trek was very good at saying like, no, people would love to carry around a little like device that has sort of omni access to everything. Long before the iPhone existed, there was the tricorder.
Kirk was there. He had it.
Exactly. The first question is, why would anyone want to live in that world? And if you can capture, which we in the book call promoting pressures, but you could sort of call lots of things, but the reason to do something, the reasons, the things that make behavior more likely, why would you want to do that? And then there's another why you have to ask, which is, well, if that's the optimal world, why don't we already live in it? If it's so clear and obvious why people would want that, why don't we already have it? Those are those inhibiting pressures. In the case of something like an iPhone, you could say, well, it runs out of battery too fast, or it's not portable enough. They're like, we do have that. It's called a laptop and the internet, but like it's large and it's clunky and it runs out of battery and it's heavy and you just go down all of these. Why are we not already there? And your job is basically to eliminate those. Your job is to the greatest possible extent, eliminate those inhibiting pressures to get to the world that we already want to live in. So it's two key whys. Where are we going? Why would we want to get there in the first place? And why aren't we already there? And then, and only then, what? What are we going to build that bridges that gap? But to your point earlier, the what, at least to me, if you do the where are we going and you do the why would we want to get there and why are we not already there, by that point, what becomes sort of obvious? It starts to feel very like, well, duh. It starts to feel like very obvious what you would build. And not in every circumstance, but I have to say, after 15 years of having these conversations with people, it starts to get really obvious to be like, oh, yeah. There's an example I love. I was talking to an airline. They had a very specific problem, which is flight attendants showing up for flights, last minute cancellations. Because of the way the airline industry works, you get this notion of a stale crew. So you can't just take the people who were doing it before and say, hey, I need you to work a double. It is incredibly important for flight timeliness that that staff shows up when they say they're going to show up and doesn't have last minute cancellations. They had done all these inhibiting pressure things, will punish the heck out of people, will get really economically costly and all these sorts of things. I was just talking to them. I was like, tell me what you've done. Like, talk to me about the approach, like, et cetera. And they said, well, why are people missing their flights in the first place? And they'd never asked that question. They only thought about like, given that people want, in air quotes, to miss a flight, how do we prevent them from doing that? And I said, well, why are they wanting it in the first place? So I came back 6 months later and they said, okay, great. We talked to the people and it turns out the majority of times, the reason people are not showing up to be a flight attendant is because of a sick kid. Last minute sick kid, can't get a babysitter. I'm going to be gone for a long period of time because it's a flight. I'm going to be gone for 24, 36 hours. It's hard to find somebody at the last minute that can take my kid for 24, 36 hours. And I don't want to leave them. I care about them. So I said, well, great. So instead of doing all these things you're doing over here, a massive pressure on people to show up, punishing the heck out of them, why don't you just give them a babysitter, right? Like there are these services you can pay for as a benefit that make sure that they get a vetted person who will in fact stay with their kid. So I came back another 6 months later and they're like, we did it, and massive decrease in last minute flight. People, I want to go to work. I want to take this flight for you. I want to fulfill my commitment to you. I can't, right? I can't, because there's this other thing that is pulling me away. If you can satisfy this other desire, great, I'll do it. There was no long, extensive market research company. It was just merely a matter of having a conversation about, well, what's the motivation here? What's going on? And then how can you affect that?
You, with your background, you're looking at the data they're giving you, and then you have developed a mental process where you can look at things differently and try and imagine it differently, see it differently. I'm going to steal a couple lines from you, because if we're staying with the flight attendant example, and this is from your work, you're kind of looking at what's the distance between our current world right now, the flight attendant problem, and the one we want to get to. You're looking at that distance. But then I'm taking another line from your work too. You're saying, okay, we want to get to this behavioral goal. So how can we apply a systematic method to implementing the interventions that achieve it? Essentially, you were doing that with the babysitter. I mean, it gets a lot more complicated with more complicated examples, but the babysitter could be very automated. You'd find the services, you'd vet things, and then it becomes something where there really doesn't have to be a lot of like worry and whatnot. The process is there. It's ready to go.
That's why, we open talking about goals versus process. I am a process-oriented person. I like process. I enjoy designing the intervention design process and sort of making it orderly. It is simply that I believe there are many processes that could be successful. I believe there is only one outcome that can be successful, and that is behavioral in nature. I am firmly convinced that simply putting out the next glossy why we do what we do sort of video, that's just marketing dollars wasted.
What you've put together, though, does require a little bit of as somebody who sees a lot of interesting academic work, what you've put together requires kind of a step back for a second, because it's a little counterintuitive. You don't initially jump into it. It's quite straightforward and quite easy to digest once you kind of see it, and it's intuitive, and it's like, well, that's Syria. Yeah, of course we should be doing it that way. But you see what I'm saying? It's kind of like, I think for many people, and you just mentioned the big example of the airline. I mean, like they should have been able to think about this already, but their focus is on other things, and persuasion doesn't necessarily work that way, just punishing people. That doesn't get to you what you want. Doesn't get to the behavior.
I got a little bit of an advantage from my field, right? Because what is social psychology or behavioral economics or whatever you want to call things these days? But I mean, it often has that feeling where you're like, why didn't I think of that before? Well, duh.
Run with the example, though. You've got one example that I've seen mentioned here multiple times with women in particular, asking for raises. This is quite clever.
This is about a product that we ended up building called GetRaised.com. It's helped women earn over $3 billion in raises based on, to your point, sort of a very simple insight where I was like, oh, crap, I've really been doing this wrong the whole time. I started to recognize that all of the things that we were building were predicated on the belief basically that women just didn't want it enough, right? That somehow the problem was like a lack of promoting pressure, a lack of motivation. I now do this thing often in audiences where I'll be like, okay, women, raise your hand if you don't want to be paid fairly. Raise your hand if you don't have that promoting pressure. And nobody ever raises their hand. Everyone wants equality. Everyone wants equity. What we did was we said, well, the dominant thing here that matters is the inhibiting pressures, right? It is hard. There are structural inhibiting pressures to equality and equity. We need to address those structural things. And so we built a tool that literally doesn't take very long. You come in, tell me what you do, where you work, how much you make. We hook up to some very public data that says, yeah, you're really underpaid. We'll go look at comparison jobs, right, in the job market. Here are other jobs you'd probably be qualified for. They also seem to have higher salaries, right? Just tell me, since the last time you got a raise, what have you done to raise your business value to the company? And what are you going to do in the next 6 months? What are you going to continue to do? And then it fills out a letter. It's literally just a Mad Lib generator for those of us who loved Mad Libs as kids. Like it's a template letter that fills in, based on the answers. More than 70% of women who hand in this letter get a raise, and the average raise is over $6,500 a year, simply because they are articulating, oh yeah, here's how wage is a formula. It's the business value I provide. And so if I provided X business value and I added Y business value, then we should add Y to the salary side of the equation. It's ended up being such a powerful insight, but I never sort of would have got there had I not sort of started to structurally think about like, well, what are all of the reasons that people do this behavior that is asking for a raise? And why don't they? Why is asking for a raise so hard? If you know you're underpaid, why is it so hard? And it just turns out that people are socialized to communicate in different ways. And we socialize women not to ask. We socialize women to ask, the wrong way. We actually socialize women to make what we call emotional appeals. I need a raise because my son is going to college, not I deserve a raise because I've brought additional business value. We just got very pointy about sort of building things that have started to address those issues. And to your point, they all at the end start feeling relatively simple. There's another one I love that I've sort of pivoted to working more on men when it comes to feminism, because ultimately we can't get there if we don't change men. So we're working on something called I Asked Her. And it started again with a core insight that actually came out of the election of Trump. There was a great New York Times article about how Trump's attitude about women had started sparking conversations in marriages about gender. He made what people described as locker room comments. And there was a couple who had been married a very long time, 30, 40 years. The man sort of downplayed them. His wife turned to him and said, well, actually, I never told you, but 40 years ago, like I was sexually assaulted. She just never told him. I was so struck by that. And I was like, if you look at the statistics, a huge number of women will at some point in their life face sexual assault, and all of them will face at least some form of sexism. And yet, even I, who have spent at that point 10 years working on this problem, really didn't know about the experiences of the women closest to me. I had never turned to my co-parent and said like, hey, Stephanie, like, what was your experience? We started this website, a very simple thing. It's literally just, and so I then said to myself, well, okay, we want to live in a world, let's go back to the process, right? We want to live in a world in which men have understand this thing. That's the behavior we want. We want men to understand. Why don't I understand? I have the promoting pressures. I want to understand. Why have I not done it? What I recognized is I didn't have the language to do it. Like there was no conversational trigger in which I could have said to Steph, hey, tell me about this part of your life. Literally all the website is just a conversational prompt, a very carefully worded conversational prompt that you can ask an emotionally close woman and explain why you want to know. I think this will make me a better man. Recognize that, I know it is hard for you to talk about. I know this is emotional labor for you, but I think I would be better. And if you're willing, I'd really like to hear about a memorable experience of sexism. Just reducing that inhibiting pressure to having the conversation that can be so powerful.
I open up your book, I'm going through it, and I made a note here. I made this Mad Men, which I've never seen one episode of. I made this Mad Men note, and I just wrote down white male privilege because I noted that you had talked about it in your book. And of course, your book is content that is universally applicable and whatnot. But, in the beginning of this conversation, you brought up the notion of, let's just say, male privilege or white male privilege. I'm curious because it's one thing to read about your perspective in words. I have a mental image of you before. And then I get on the phone with you and it's like, okay, nice guy, earnest, very smart. It makes me want to listen to your perspective to find out what the perspective is. Now, as I say all that, though, when one makes the statement and says, well, male privilege or white male privilege, I would think that it's a fair assessment that in the current modern day America, half the white males, probably along party lines, are going to tune out. And the ones that tune out might not be bad people. They might be fine people. They might be better than the other half of the other group, whatever. It's charged. And I'm curious how you have thought about it, because you've obviously made the decision to walk into look, you want to teach, you don't care about someone's partisanship. You want to teach whoever wants to learn. And of course, there's plenty of conservatives that are nice people. There's plenty of folks on the liberal side that are nice people. But you are walking into the forum with some charged language. I'm curious your thought process and how you decided to walk into the arena, so to speak, and be charged like that.
Some of it's selfish. I want to be able to be my full and authentic self in most situations. I don't do well as a person when I'm not able to be who I am as a person. For many years, people have been asking me to write a book, and the publishing industry, I won't name what publisher, but one of the publishers, for example, came to me and said like, well, you had this no speaking fee policy and you speak for free and, you donate your thing to domestic violence shelters and stuff. And we want you to stop doing that. We only agree to speak if people buy some number of the book. If the conference agrees to buy 500 of the book, then speak there. And I was like, look, I'd rather not write a book. That universe is not one I want to live in. That is not towards the optimal end of the spectrum.
I don't think anybody on any partisan stripe could criticize you for having that perspective. You just say that's pretty noble. Like, maybe I would do it differently, but I can't criticize. I'm like, well, that's pretty cool that he's made that choice.
Part of it is selfish. Part of the reason that I try to recognize privilege and say what I want to say and be who I want to be is personal. The other thing that I will say is, I did this research a few years ago where PayScale knew that I did this work. And so they came to me and they said, hey, you want to throw anything in our survey? We'll do it for free. And I said, sure. I want to ask two questions. One, do you think women have equal opportunities in workplaces in general? And do you think men and women have equal opportunities in your workplace? And 3 in 5 men said yes to both questions. They fundamentally believe that the world is equal, both in general and where they are. When I think about how to change the perspective of those 3 to 5 men, if cowboy boot wearing, big belt buckled, cursing people like me, the people that I talk to aren't always on the same side of many issues as me. But because I come from a place or have done certain things, I've been given permission to say something to them. And I want to use that permission to say something meaningful. And I don't think it's separate and disconnected from the book. You cannot be a behavioral scientist. You can't truly be a behavioral scientist, I think, and not be interested in change and not be interested in a world that looks different. One of the things that I think is really interesting and powerful about articulating the behavior that we want is there are many men who would say, I'm not a feminist. This is not an issue with which I grapple. But if you described the world that occurs if we don't grapple, then they would be fervently willing to fight against that world.
That is a great point. And that's kind of what I was just about to say, is that if we talk about the data and we talk about the big picture of what the differences are and perhaps how we got to those differences, I think most people can engage in that conversation. The part that I think that breaks down sometimes is the moment there's a label that can get very political, then people, half the contingent on either side, whatever the issue is, tunes out. And so it's like, if we could all do a better job of, at least this is just as my perspective, I think sometimes the labels really cause people to just immediately think, oh man, I don't want to listen to what Matt has to say. He's just used this particular phrase or whatnot. But then again, if you're on stage, you get a chance to speak to the audience. At least they get to hear your full view.
We talk about these 3 in 5 men who would answer yes to both questions. And when you look at what actually changes their behavior, the number one thing is having daughters. When you have the personal experience of exposure to these people who you're responsible for protecting in the world, and you see the way that the world treats them, you change your mind. There's a great study actually where you can look at VCs, for example, venture capitalists, before and after they have daughters. And after they have daughters, they're much more likely to invest in female founders. As a consequence, they have better portfolio returns after they have daughters because they start investing in women. There is something I'm riffing on what you're saying, when we make it intellectual, when we make it abstract, I think we tune out. That's why, hence I asked her and trying to get people to have the conversations with women that are emotionally close to them. When it becomes emotional, it can become very powerful. Maybe one of the reasons I care so much about this issue is I recognize it is emotional for me. I am disappointed in my own behavior at times. When I think about when I feel worst about myself as a man and as a person, it is those times when I don't bring my full self, when I don't do the right thing. And I think so much of why we reject this issue and so many issues is recognition of our own failures and our shame. It is hard to confront our own shame. I think the only way we get there is by putting ourselves in an emotionally vulnerable place and having those conversations with the people who we're able to hear it from. And if they're not, if somebody hears it from me and that makes them tune out, maybe I'm okay with that. But what I would hope is, I think about musical acts that have, I'm going to say, betrayed their genre. For example, when the Dixie Chicks came out against the Iraq War, they're operating in a genre where people are really angry about that viewpoint, really angry about that viewpoint. But by saying it, they created the space for some people who were within that group who hadn't felt able to talk about it, who disagreed. They disagreed with the dominant norm, but they didn't feel they were able to say that. They created space for that. And maybe so much of what we do as behavioral scientists and thought leaders and people in the world is create space for other voices.
I got to tell you, we mentioned at the top of this show, and you mentioned also living in Hong Kong. For me, living in a foreign culture, having the chance to be around 99.9% people that are different than me, and I speak very little of the language. I would say English is pretty popular in the big cities, but it's still pretty rare in a place like Vietnam. But that experience changes you, because then all of a sudden, here I am in an environment completely outside of the state's melting pot, and I get to observe the state's debates and arguments from afar. Being a minority, it's really enjoyable to get outside of the cauldron that's boiling in the States and just see things differently. I am forever grateful that I've had a chance to fall into this situation, probably like you were forever grateful to fall into it at age 15.
And I had experiences that I don't really talk about when I talk about gender equity and other kinds of equity in the world, and I care about more than just gender. I don't often talk about my own experiences, but it's definitely true that I remember at 15, in many Asian cultures, it's not rude to stare, which is very different than American culture. So I remember being on the subway in Hong Kong and people just staring at me because I was this big, tall, 6-foot cowboy booted white guy, and I had long hair, and I just didn't fit in. I remember people staring at me, and I remember, I don't think it was until later I was like, that's what it must feel like to be stared at. Women are objectified and all sorts of, there's all these things that I was like, oh, wow.
Could you also look at it, though, that Asian folks in many ways, to me, are just so dang curious that they don't necessarily have a nefarious thing to their stare. They just are so curious. They're like, who are you? What are you? Where'd you come from?
I didn't mean it to be negative intended. But it provokes the same feeling of discomfort until you sort of figure out where it's coming from culturally. It has that same feeling of like,
until you enjoy it.
Or at least, I don't know if I ever learned to enjoy it, but I at least learned to understand and accept it.
Maybe I'm really weird. I enjoy the curiosity.
No, I enjoy the curiosity, but some of the behaviors it prompts, like, people used to come up on the street and take pictures with me, and I'm like, what is, like, I don't even understand what's going on. Like, I was just, to a 15-year-old, sort of befuddling. And I do actually think living cross-culturally makes you a better behavioral scientist. I really do. Because to your point, it helps you step out of a situation. It gives you that ability to sort of let something else wash over you in a different way and just sort of be sort of a sensing, perceiving sort of entity. Because it's like your brain. When somebody's speaking in English, if you're a native English speaker and someone's speaking in English, your brain cannot help but listen and then filters it out. It listens and says, that's not important and it's not directed at me, and I'll filter it out. But it still hears and it still listens and it still filters. And you burn resources doing that. When you're somewhere else, you get this lovely experience of freeing up these cognitive resources because you're like, I actually don't have any idea what's going on. This actually loops bizarrely back to like the automating of the clothes. You're forced to sort of automate some things in Asia because you literally have no control over them or don't understand enough of what's going on to be able to intervene. So even if you had a different preference, it isn't clear that you could do anything about it. Someone hands you a menu that's entirely in Vietnamese, and you're like, well, I can't care about the food. I'm not allowed to find the best thing on this menu because I have no idea. So I'm just going to pick randomly, and I'm going to enjoy learning about whatever the hell actually shows up.
This is true. I mean, sometimes I think maybe in the States, and we all grow up and we get fixated and worried on small things, and they really are small in the grand scheme of things.
Because they are within our control, right? There's this dominant American narrative of if it's in your control, you should control it. That's not true. And I think one of the things that Asian culture, both Vietnamese in your case and Chinese in my case, has cultivated is some things you just leave to the gods. There's this Joss in Chinese, like there's all these words in Asia that are sort of like, shigaraganai, right? In Japanese, like, what will be. There's that permissioning to not care or not exercise control that I think is amazing and really freeing. in some ways, I've never actually articulated this. I love great conversation because it causes you to articulate or think about things you don't normally think about. There is certainly something in my approach to behavioral science that came from my time in Asia of sort of being selective about where we spend our mental resources and where we change behavior and where we just let it play out naturally.
Well, when you're in a foreign culture like that too, and it could be any foreign culture, if you don't, you learn the language. I can't really say that I have so far, but in some ways it's another one of these little hacks where you can let go of spending mental energy on XYZ because I don't hear English a lot necessarily. I get to talk to smart people like you, but not hearing English a lot, I've actually developed a little system where I think I enjoy not having the noise.
Mm-hmm.
100%. Because so much of us in what we've got going on in the States these days is noise. If we're really being honest with ourselves, how much of what we're really doing in the States in terms of our conversations is just kind of menial, kind of like stuff that we should really be looking in the mirror and saying, hold on, we've only got limited time. They've not figured out life extension yet. So why are we not working on things that really matter?
I've had this is going to be a controversial statement on the liberal side of things. I've had a bizarre experience recently. People who listen to this podcast years later and laugh at this, but we have this simultaneously weird legislative thing that's happening in the US where we're decriminalizing marijuana and recriminalizing abortion. And there are all these liberals who are like so happy that we're decriminalizing marijuana and isn't that amazing? And there are racial and other kinds of implications of doing that are important. Of these two problems, let's not celebrate the weed thing. Let's work on the abortion things. These are not the conversation we should be having at the time. To your point, there's so much just wanting to beat the other side on something. I'm like, no, I want to beat you on the things that matter. I don't care about the things that don't.
But everyone on their side thinks their stuff matters.
Everyone thinks everything matters. And that's part of the problem. Everyone thinks everything matters. And living in Asia or living somewhere else outside of your own culture, you'll realize there are things that matter and there are things that don't. Like the most amazing food in the world. Gosh, I need food that I can eat. Right? That's what I'm shooting for. I'm shooting for food that I can eat, clothes that I can wear. This was a huge problem for me in Hong Kong. I'm 6 feet tall. Trying to find clothes that were in any kind of proportion to my body was sometimes a challenge. It really does cause you to focus on those things. And I have never thought about it or really articulated those experiences because they're, at this point, it's 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago.
So listen, I've already kept you over here, but, just to make sure the audience is clear, I'm holding a book in my hands, Start at the End, How to Build Products That Create Change. And believe it or not, it is a very detailed guide, regardless of one's beliefs or understandings about current interesting issues in the social sphere. If one wants to build products that create change, you are giving people a nice guide and a nice perspective and a lot of research and a lot of detail and making the strong case about how to go about it. So we've touched on some things today in our conversation. We've covered a lot of interesting things, but I just want people to understand too that they should definitely check your work out.
Yeah, I hope people enjoy the book. It is very distinctively mine. It's been lovely from friends who have read it, been like, well, I can hear you reading it to me. When I read it, I hear you come through and I'm like, great. Like it or hate it, at least it is authentically mine. And hopefully it is a very practical guide, but one that comes with cursing and entertaining examples and things that help people. I would love to write a book for people who don't normally read, who haven't read other behavioral science books, who aren't ready for Danny Kahneman or any of the other wonderful people that you've named, but that want to start down this path. Hopefully it's something you all will enjoy, and I invite your feedback.
Matt, is there a website or any place you want to send audience members to? Where should they go to check you out?
I'm at mattwallaert.com. I'm on Twitter at Matt Wallaert, and I love conversation. I've loved this conversation with you, Michael, and it's made me think, and I deeply appreciate that. So I always appreciate conversation. It's, as we talked about earlier, right? I believe passionately in being easy to get to. So you can tweet at me, you can email me, matt@mattwallaert.com. You can go see me on my website, mattwallaert.com. But read the book, enjoy each other, and go change the behavior.
Matt, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Take care, man.
Michael, thanks for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.